Good afternoon. My name is Vincent DeLuise, and on behalf of Flanders Nature Center, I'm very happy to be with you here today to talk about Natalie Van Vleck. I am an assistant professor of ophthalmology at Yale University School of Medicine on the Humanities and Medicine Committee at Weill Cornell Medical College in New York, and I'm also the cultural ambassador of the Waterbury Symphony Orchestra. I am also a long-term resident here in Woodbury, about 40 years. My family and I have lived here, and also a longtime supporter and donor to all of Flanders Nature Center's wonderful efforts and initiatives. The title of my talk this afternoon is Natalie Van Vleck's Journey into Modernism. Natalie Van Vleck was an astonishing, fascinating, and brilliant woman. Born in 1901, she lived a nice long life of 80 years, mostly here in Woodbury, Connecticut after her schooling, and left a legacy of beauty in her wake. Beauty in art and beauty in the nature conservancy that she so passionately ascribed to and gave to us all as her legacy. Natalie was born on October 19th, 1901, and her family was quite prominent. Her father's side, the Van Vlecks, were among the first Dutch explorers into New Amsterdam. On her mother's side, the Macy family, another prominent early American family. Natalie was reared wealthy and with a lot of means. She attended the Brearley School, a private school in Manhattan, and joined the Art Students League under the aegis of Agnes Richmond. Here we see Natalie at age 4 in this anonymous portrait from 1905. And we should remember that for Natalie, the landscape of her farm in Woodbury was her painting palette. The farm and farmhouse on Flanders Road was bought by her family in 1926 when she was 25 years old. The turkey farm in 1934. Flanders was chartered as a nonprofit in 1963, and the Land Trust was founded in 1973. What I want to talk about this afternoon in my talk is the arc and trajectory of Natalie's artistic journey with nature and with life. And in fact, she demonstrated many different artistic styles along the way, especially in the period between 1919 and 1934, where her works channel many of the great artists who had changed and were changing how pictorial representation was for art, going from true representational art into cubism and non-representational art. Among the artists which we see in her paintings in terms of her channeling their genius were Van Gogh, Seurat, Cézanne, Picasso, Braque, Brancusi. And it's interesting to see and to think about whether painting in general is a biographical art form, or is it an autobiographical art form, or perhaps, as in Natalie's case, both. Natalie had two major influencers in her artistic journey, apart from Agnes. Those were Robert Henry of the Ashcan School, and Max Weber, the American Cubist. Robert Henry said to Natalie, "Follow your own approach to painting. Don't follow a particular school." And Max Weber taught her cubic fraction and abstraction, how expressive distortion and the spiritual qualities can be embodied in painting, looking at ancient paintings as models. Max Weber said that art is nature, and for man to tell of his spiritual communion in art is art. For man to tell of his spiritual communion in nature is art, is itself art. That nature is art through man. When art builds on art, art dies. One of the famous paintings of Max Weber from the mid-1910s was this painting called The Cellist, which is now in the Brooklyn Museum, and we can see that it channels the Picasso-Braque cubistic theories of the time. Natalie was also influenced, as I mentioned earlier, by Paul Cézanne, and here's one of Cézanne's many portraits of his wife. This one was from 1890 in the Barnes Foundation. Here's one of Natalie's early works. She was 17 years old when she painted this one. And what's interesting about Natalie's works is the way she describes the paintings, the way she titles them. So this one's titled Girl with Dark Hair, Tricorned Hat on a Green Wall. So everything about the painting is actually inside, implicit in the title itself. And I think you can see some of the monumentality of Cézanne and Picasso and Braque in this glorious early painting of Natalie Van Vleck. Here we see another painting by Natalie. This is from 1920, a young woman in a blue blouse. And interestingly, this channels Japanese prints, which were a style of art that was also quite much of interest to artists such as Gauguin and Van Gogh. They were fascinated by Japanese art and used it in their own paintings in the latter part of the 19th century. So it seems to me that Natalie was also quite taken by Japanese art, its simplicity, the monumentality of the form, the color, and you can see that in this painting, Young Woman in a Blue Blouse. This painting here, of course, is one of the famous guitarist paintings by Pablo Picasso, around the time that Picasso was changing the rules of art, going from a representational form into Cubism, which of course was the first great abstract genre of pictorial art. And here's one of Natalie's paintings from around 1922. This one is called A Cubist Reclining Nude with a Fantastic Colored Background. Again, Natalie giving us quite a bit of description in the title of this painting, which in my view channels the monumentality and the fracturing of space that Braque and Picasso did. Here again we see a Natalie Van Vleck painting. This is from 1921. Again, the fracturing of space. This is called an abstract rocky landscape. And certainly you can see it sort of as a landscape, and the bluish coloration at the top could be the sky, and the orangey brown forms, cubic forms and triangular forms, could be the rocks themselves, but it's certainly deconstructed in a way that would make you think of it as a cubist painting. And again, channeling the genius of Picasso and Braque and Max Weber, the other early cubists. Here's another Natalie Van Vleck painting from that period, the early 1920s. This one's called Cubist Rocky Landscape with Rainbow. And again, we see the monumentality of the forms. They're kind of deconstructed. We do see a rainbow, part of the arc on the left side and part of the arc on the right side, with clouds perhaps there that are colored brownish purple. A very interesting painting, which again channels a lot of cubistic form. And here we have another painting from the early 1920s, this one from 1922. Natalie Van Vleck, this is called Standing Nude with a Tripod Lamp and Table from a Studio. Again, the objects in the room are deconstructed into forms, large monumental forms of space. The body itself is somewhat deconstructed into large pieces, large fragments. And again, this could be called a cubist painting. Here's a woodcut. Natalie worked in very different styles. She worked in oils, she worked in pastels, she worked in woodcuts. She did a lot of paints and artwork in different genres and different styles. This one is from 1922, and again, in my view at least, there's a cubistic quality to this abstract nude torso in which the form, the female form, and the background all have a monumental cubistic type of style. I put this painting up to remind us of one of the great masters of the Renaissance, someone whose name we don't know, so we call this person the master of the female half-lengths. That's the name of the painter because we don't have a name of this individual who worked in Northern Europe in the mid-1500s. And the reason I put this wonderful painting up, this is called Three Musicians, is because to me, it makes me think of Natalie's frequent visits to Europe, to the art museums of Europe that she did when she was a young woman. And in my view, I see a bit of that master of the female half-lengths in this painting. It's called, by Natalie, Five Female Half-Lengths Mediterranean. So we actually have the word half-lengths inside the painting title by Natalie Van Vleck. And it channels, to me at least, that master, and you can see the painting on the left, as well as a bit of Gauguin's Polynesian works, which you see with the cap on the form in Natalie's painting on the right, and that painting on the far right is a painting by Gauguin. So again, in my view, Natalie brilliantly channels some of the great artists of the past in her own artwork. Here's another painting with the half-lengths title, in its title, by Natalie. Natalie calls this one, again, 5 female half-lengths Mediterranean from 1924. Again, there's a monumentality of the form. There's a deconstruction of the form. The colors are simplified. There's not a lot of texture and nuance here. It's all fairly bold and brilliant, and it comes right up at you. And yet she's channeling a 500-year-old art form with the master of the female half-lengths, and in my view, some of Gauguin's work from 3 decades earlier. And there's that Gauguin self-portrait from 1889 from the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Here's Natalie's portrait of a woman with black pyramidal hair in a chair with spiral posts. Again, Natalie giving us quite a bit of detail about the painting itself in the title of the painting. And again, as I've said, for several of the works we've looked at already, there's a monumentality of the form, there's a simplification of the form, there's not a lot of texture and nuance in terms of the background. It's very much reminds us of those Japanese prints. It's right there, and it's monumental, and it's monochromatic in many ways, and stylized. And so I think, again, here Natalie is showing us some of the influences that she had on her frequent trips to Europe and her studying of art history. Here we see one of the many famous Constantine Brancusi heads. This is from 1912. It's called La Muse Endormie, Muse Sleeping. And here's Natalie's homage to Brancusi. This is Natalie Van Vleck's portrait head of a young woman in microcrystalline wax from about 1930. And again, there's a monumentality about this piece of art. This is a sculpture now, not a painting or a woodcut. In the 1930s, around 1934, Natalie abruptly changed from that cubistic style that we just saw many examples of to what I would call a more regionalistic precisionist style. Here we have hard edge forms and rounded volumes. Again, that monumentality stays with us, but there's more of a spirituality to her paintings. Here I think she's thinking about what Max Weber taught her to think about in terms of painting. So here's one of Natalie's many paintings of animals, probably from the farm here in Woodbury where she lived. This one's called Four Deer. Although it has an Italian hill town as a background in terms of the title, it may have been actually envisioned by her here back in Woodbury, although she did make several trips to Italy during her life, so she may have actually seen this in reality when she was on one of her trips. Here's another painting. This one's called Anthuriums Against the Distant Mountain from 1930. And again, we see a simplified form, monumental shapes, simplistic background, nothing really difficult to understand or comprehend. And yet it shows the precision in which Natalie painted and her great abilities in many different styles of art. This is my favorite painting by Natalie Van Vleck, and it's owned by someone here in Woodbury. It's called Thunderstorm Barn, Woodbury from 1929. And it reminds me a lot of the works of the WPA artist Thomas Hart Benton, who was prominent around this time and whose masterpieces can be seen here in Connecticut at the New Britain Museum of American Art. I just love this painting for so many reasons. First of all, it's monumental in style, in scope, and in size. There's a stylization of the clouds, of the sky, of the barn, of the hills, that really is quite genius in my view. It's as simplistic as it is. At the same time as it's simplistic, it's also quite brilliantly complicated. This was not an easy painting to paint. We actually see the rain coming down on the right. That's actually a cascade of rain in a shower on the right side of this painting. This is one of my favorite paintings, if not the most famous and favorite painting, I should say, that of mine, of Natalie Van Vleck. And again, in my view, she's channeling some of the works of art of Thomas Hart Benton in this type of painting style. Here's another one of the paintings of Natalie from the same year, 1929. This one is called White Salt Box, Red Barns, Woodbury. So here we know we are here in our hometown of Woodbury, 1929. And again, that stylized clouds and sky that we saw in the prior work of the thunderstorm is also exemplified here with the barns. And again, things are deconstructed, colors are simplified, stylized, and yet there's a unique charm and quality to her paintings that are really wonderful. My second favorite painting is this one. This is North Church, Woodbury, which you see on the hill there, surrounded by homes and perhaps businesses of the time, 1928. And again, you have that monumentality of form, that simplification of the color line, the stylization of the clouds, of the sky in the background. Just a charming, unique work, cubistic as it might be, but regionalistic at the same time. Here again, we have one of Natalie's many regionalistic types of works. This one's called Exotic Foliage and Orchid Against the Distant Mountain from 1930. And we have a Bird of Paradise in gouache, which is a type of painting where you have layers and layers and layers of paint to create more texture and nuance to the painting. So that's a gouache painting from 1929. Here's a spotted turtle and some leaves from 1930. Spotted turtles can be found on the property in Flanders, along with eastern painted turtles. And so why Natalie Van Vleck suddenly dropped painting in the mid-1930s will always be shrouded in some mystery. Nevertheless, the discovery of her artistic collection, untouched and in storage for more than half a century, provides us with a strong reminder that she was a fiercely independent artist who developed her own philosophy on how to pursue a life in which art and nature ultimately became one. Those are the words of Peter Hastings Falk in his wonderful biography and catalog of artworks of Natalie Van Vleck. And let's remember that Flanders' mission is to foster understanding and appreciation of nature, art, and the wonders of the natural world through land preservation, stewardship, and education. Flanders' vision is to safeguard a future in which our scenic landscapes, forests, wetlands, agricultural lands, and wildlife habitats are preserved forever. And indeed, Natalie Van Vleck's own mission was to foster understanding and appreciation of nature, art, and the wonders of the natural world through land preservation and stewardship. And Natalie Van Vleck's own vision was to safeguard a future in which our scenic landscapes, forests, wetlands, agricultural lands, and wildlife habitats are preserved forever. And let's remember the words of Hippocrates in closing, which is that art is long, but life is short. Opportunity is fleeting, experimentation dangerous, and judgment difficult. Natalie Van Vleck lived life her way, and she created beautiful art and conserved nature for a lasting legacy that benefits us all. Thank you very much.